Pedro Plata was not an ordinary man. He was a safe harbor in the midst of a storm of sand and blood that swept the Mexican border in the 90s. His path to that dusty pulpit was paved with an unshakable faith, a conviction that even in the heart of darkness, light could find a crack to bloom. As the pastor of a small community oppressed by the violence of the Los Espectros cartel, his voice was a balm for wounded souls, an echo of hope in alleys where despair was the only law. He believed in forgiveness, in redemption, and in the power of the divine word to transform the hardest of hearts. Before we delve deeper into this story of transformation and fury, if you're not yet part of our community, I ask you to subscribe to the channel. We're about to hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and knowing where you're watching from helps us continue to bring reports like this one. Leave your comment. Your presence is very important to us. The true essence of his faith, however, did not lie only in fiery sermons, but in the sparkle in the eyes of his wife, Elena, and the contagious laughter of his little daughter, Sophia. They were his private sanctuary, the living proof of the divine grace he so often preached. Away from the altar, Pedro was simply a husband and a father, whose days were measured in lullabies and tight hugs. The parish house, a modest annex to the church, was an oasis of love and simplicity, immune to the brutality that lurked outside. Every moment with them reinforced his belief that kindness was the only weapon needed to defeat evil. It was this idyllic life, this hard-won peace, that nourished his soul and gave him the strength to guide his flock through the valley of the shadow of death that his city had become. The fictional city of Santa Magdalena del Desierto was a purgatory on earth, a strategic corridor for drug trafficking, controlled with an iron fist by the Los Espectros cartel. Led by the enigmatic and sadistic El Sombra, the cartel's men were ghosts that haunted every corner, their influence infiltrating the police, politics, and the daily lives of the citizens. Fear was the common currency. Amidst this moral desolation, Pedro Plata's church stood as a solitary fortress, not of bricks, but of spirit. For the community, the church bells not only marked the hours, but also rang out as an act of defiance, a fragile yet persistent declaration that not all was lost, and that hope still found refuge in that sacred space. On a sunny Sunday, the heavy air of Santa Magdalena seemed lighter inside the church. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in vibrant colors as Pedro, in his impeccable cassock, spoke of the parable of the prodigal son. His oratory was magnetic, a mixture of paternal authority and genuine compassion. He did not shout, he welcomed. His eyes scanned the suffering faces of his faithful, offering them not the promise of a life without pain, but the certainty that they were not alone in their suffering. At that moment, he was the personification of forgiveness, a man whose faith in humanity seemed infinite, even when confronted with the most abject cruelty. He believed that even the men of El Sombra could find their way back, a belief that would soon be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The influence of Los Espectros was like a cancer, seeking to corrupt everything healthy in the city. Inevitably, their eyes turned to the church, not for faith, but for convenience. The cartel needed to launder its dirty money, and Pastor Plata's immaculate reputation, along with the donations his church received, offered the perfect front. One of El Sombra's lieutenants made the offer, a veiled proposal that carried the weight of a death threat. They didn't ask, they informed. The church would become part of their business, and the pastor would be rewarded for his cooperation. For the cartel, it was standard procedure, a simple business transaction where refusal was not a viable or safe option for the one who uttered it. Pedro listened to the proposal with a calmness that disarmed the cartel's messenger. In his heart, there was no hesitation. His church was the house of God, a refuge for the afflicted, not a laundry for money stained with the blood of his own people. He refused the offer with the same firmness with which he preached his convictions. There was no speech, no condemnation, just a serene and unshakable no. For Pedro, to accept would be a betrayal of everything he stood for, a desecration of the holy ground he had sworn to protect. He knew the risks, understood perfectly that his no was a sentence, but the integrity of his faith and the safety of his spiritual community were worth more than his own life. He sent them away, naively believing that the sanctity of his calling would protect him. Pedro's refusal was received by El Sombra, not as an act of courage, but as an unforgivable insolence. From that day on, the atmosphere around the church changed. The fragile peace that surrounded it was replaced by a palpable tension. Cars with tinted windows passed slowly down the street, their occupants watching every move. Cartel members, previously discreet in their presence, now stood on nearby corners, their impassive faces a constant reminder of the threat. The shadow of Los Espectros stretched over the house of God, and the faithful began to fear attending services. The community, which saw Pedro as their shield, now saw him as the epicenter of an imminent danger that his own righteousness had brought upon them all. That night, the last night of his old life, Pedro tried to build a fortress of normalcy within his home. He played with Sofia until she fell asleep with a smile on her face, and then sat with Elena in the small living room, the silence between them filled with a mutual understanding of the danger they faced. He held her hand, tracing the lines of her palm as if to memorize every detail. He told her that God would protect them, that faith was their shield. However, for the first time in his life, a poisonous doubt crept into his soul. As he looked at his family, the love he felt for them was so overwhelming that it mixed with a primordial fear, a terror that no prayer seemed capable of quelling. It was the fear of a man who had everything to lose. The night fell over Santa Magdalena with an ominous silence, a cloak of darkness that seemed thicker than usual. Inside the church, a few candles illuminated a small group of faithful gathered for evening prayer, an intimate gathering of souls seeking comfort. Elena played a soft melody on the old organ, while Sofia colored drawings of angels near the altar. The tranquility was shattered without warning. The massive wooden doors burst inward, and the shadows that once only lurked outside now invaded the sanctuary. Led by El Perro, the sadistic right-hand man of El Sombra, the cartel's men moved with brutal efficiency, turning the sacred refuge into a death trap. The terrified screams of the faithful mixed with the sound of gunfire, echoing profanely against walls that had only known hymns and prayers. Pedro reacted with the primal instinct of a protector. His body moved before his mind could process the horror, pushing Elena and Sofia behind the altar, trying to use his own presence as a human shield. He shouted, not as a pastor, but as a cornered animal defending its young, begging them to stop, offering himself in exchange for the lives of his family and his flock. But his pleas were met with cruel laughter. El Perro approached, the contempt on his face evident. He saw before him not a man of God, but an insolent obstacle that needed to be removed. Pedro's helplessness was absolute. His faith, his words, everything that defined him was useless against the tide of violence that engulfed him. The horror that followed was an indelible stain on Pedro's soul. He was forced to watch, immobilized by two sicarios as El Perro approached his family. The act was carried out with calculated cruelty, a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge the power of El Sombra. The altar, the most sacred place of his existence, where he had baptized his daughter and blessed his union with Elena, became the stage for its final desecration. The image of their lives being extinguished in that holy place burned into his retina, a private hell that would consume him forever. The sound of the organ was silenced, the last note hanging in the air like a ghostly lament. The blood of his wife and daughter stained the white altar cloth, a sacrilege that instantly annihilated the man he had once been. Left to die in a pool of his own blood and grief, Pedro heard the assassin's boots walk away, followed by the sound of their laughter fading into the night. The silence that fell upon the church was more deafening than any scream. Every breath was agony. With what strength he had left, he dragged himself across the cold stone floor, past the bodies of his friends and faithful, until he reached the altar. There, he embraced the still warm bodies of Elena and Sophia. The cry that tore from his throat was an inhuman sound, a wail from a soul being shattered. His hand, trembling and bloodied, found the base of the heavy wooden cross from his pulpit. He grasped it, not as a symbol of faith and sacrifice, but as the only solid thing in a world that had disintegrated into pure savagery. On that desecrated floor, clinging to the cross and to his dead, the prayer that sprang from Pedro's lips was not addressed to God. It was a dark promise, an oath forged in the fire of the purest hatred. If heaven remained silent in the face of such an atrocity, then he would become the answer. If divine justice did not exist, he would create it with his own hands. There would be no forgiveness. There would be no redemption. From that moment on, justice would no longer be an abstract concept, but a hunt. Every man who took part in that massacre, every soul who served El Sombra, would pay with their own life. The pain he felt would not destroy him. It would transform him. The pastor was dead, and from his ashes the vigilante was born, with a heart turned to stone and vengeance as his one and terrible gospel. In the months that followed the massacre, Pedro Plata simply vanished. To the terrified community of Santa Magdalena and to the official records of the corrupt police, he was just another victim, his body lost among the rubble and grief. But in the shadows of the desert, a different man was being forged. He found refuge in an abandoned cabin, a spectre haunted by the memory of fire and screams. It was there that he performed the final ritual of his symbolic death. On a cold night, under a starless sky, he took his pastor's cassock, the garment that carried the weight of his blessings and his lost faith, and threw it into a crackling fire. Watching the black fabric be consumed by the flames, he felt no sadness, only the cold vacuum of a purpose that now completely defined him. Survival in hiding required resources, and Pedro began to move with a cunning purpose. The pastor knew the weaknesses and secrets of his flock, not only the spiritual, but also the mundane. He knew where a repentant merchant, who had once confessed to him about his undeclared money, kept his savings. Accessing these funds with surgical precision, he saw them not as theft, but as a posthumous donation to his new and terrible mission. With the money, he bought his first weapon, a heavy, cold pistol that felt foreign in a hand accustomed to holding the Bible. He began to map the cartel's routine, turning his intimate knowledge of the city into a hunting map, every street and alley a potential battlefield for the war to come. His first prey was a low-level sicario, a young man whose face he vividly remembered from the church massacre. Pedro cornered him in a fetid alley, behind a cantina. The confrontation was not cinematic. It was clumsy, desperate, and brutal. The young man, arrogant at first, soon found himself overwhelmed by a fury that did not belong to this world. Pedro felt every punch, every blow, the sound of breaking bones echoing in his ears. The act of taking a life was terribly intimate, a violation of everything he had ever preached. When it was over, he vomited in the darkness, his body shaking uncontrollably. Vengeance brought no relief, only the bitter confirmation that the pastor inside him was truly dead and buried alongside his family. The news of the sicario's death spread quickly, but in a distorted way. In the underworld of Santa Magdalena, life was cheap. Initially, the cartel assumed it was a rival settling a score or an internal dispute. However, the unusual details of the death, the raw and almost ritualistic violence, began to fuel whispers in the streets. People started talking about a ghost, a shadow that hunted the butchers who tormented them. A different kind of fear began to settle in the hearts of the cartel members, not the fear of a rival's bullet, but the dread of the unknown. For the oppressed citizens, this nascent legend was a terrifying paradox, a spark of hope wrapped in the deepest and most violent darkness. The name Vigilante was whispered for the first time. The case landed on the desk of Detective Morales, a man aged by the corrupt landscape in which he worked. Morales was an anomaly, an honest cop. He examined the crime scene in the alley and immediately sensed that this was not the work of the cartel. The arrogant signature, the message of power, was missing. In its place, there was a personal, almost sacred fury. It was then that he found, pressed into the victim's hand, a tiny, almost imperceptible page torn from a missile. It was not a clue left carelessly, but a silent statement. Morales felt a chill. He wasn't investigating a gang war. He was on the trail of a sermon, written in blood, and he knew this was just the first verse of a psalm of vengeance. Pedro learned from the brutality of his first act. Hesitation, nausea were luxuries he could no longer afford. He needed to be more efficient, more lethal. His mind, once occupied with theology and parables, now focused on tactics and vulnerabilities. He began to use the secrets entrusted to him in the confessional in a perverse way. The weaknesses, the vices, the hidden fears of the cartel men, revealed to him, in moments of false penance, became his most powerful arsenal. He didn't use the information to expose them, but to predict their movements, to isolate them, to turn their secret lives into deadly traps. Every past confession he had heard was now a weapon in his private war, making him a predator with an almost omniscient knowledge of his prey. The hunt escalated. The next target was one of El Perro's lieutenants, a man known for his cruelty and ostentation. This time, Pedro planned the execution as a public statement, an unequivocal message to the top of the chain of command. After a quick and silent ambush in a parking lot, he did not hide the body. Instead, he left it tied to the wheel of his luxury car, parked in front of the corrupt police headquarters. On the man's chest, pinned with a knife, was a rosary, and a single word had been carved into his forehead: Judas. The message was clear. The vengeance that was coming was not random. It was a judgment, and the vigilante feared neither the cartel nor the law they controlled. El Sombra, from the height of his empire, felt the first pang of an irritation that would soon become concern. The death of his lieutenant, executed so boldly and symbolically, was a direct insult to his authority. He summoned El Perro, and with a cold fury ordered the head of this ghost to be brought to him. The hunt was now a two-way street. Paranoia began to seep into the ranks of Los Espectros. The sicarios, once supreme predators, now looked over their shoulders, distrusting the shadows and each other. The legend of the vigilante was no longer just a rumor. It was a tangible threat that was eroding the loyalty and discipline of the criminal organization from within, exactly as Pedro had planned. On rare, quiet nights, the weight of what he was becoming would crush Pedro. In his dusty cabin, he kept a single worn photograph of Eleanor and Sophia smiling on a sunny day. Looking at it was both a torture and his only source of strength. In those moments, the vigilante would disappear, and the grieving husband and father would re-emerge, his soul screaming in agony. The memories of their laughter, of the warmth of their hugs, were now ghosts that accused him. He wondered what they would say if they could see him now, his hands stained with blood and his heart full of hatred. The answer was a torment, but the image of the desecrated altar would always resurface, erasing any doubt and solidifying his resolve into cold, unbreakable steel. It was during one of his nightly incursions into the city that a shadow called his name. "Pedro!" The voice hit him like a lightning bolt, a sound from a world he had left behind. It was Maria, a young woman from his former congregation, whose family he had helped in difficult times. Her eyes, wide with shock and sadness, recognized him under the hood he wore. She had seen him sneaking through an alley and had followed him, moved by an incredulous hope. To her, he was a ghost who had come back to life. But as she looked at his hardened face, at the coldness in his eyes, she realized that the man standing there was not the pastor who had saved her, but something much darker. Her existence became a dangerous complication, the only living witness to his transition. Maria confronted him days later, finding his hideout with a desperate determination. She didn't accuse him. She pleaded. With tears in her eyes, she spoke of the man who had taught her about forgiveness. The man who preached that violence only begets more violence. Look at you, Pedro. They've turned you into the monster you swore to fight. This won't bring Elena and Sofia back, she begged, her voice choked with emotion. Pedro listened with a stony patience, his face an impassive mask. That man died in that church along with them, he replied, his voice a low, harsh growl. Forgiveness is a luxury for those who still have something to lose. I have nothing, only debts to collect. He sent her away, the chasm between them now unbridgeable. Meanwhile, Detective Morales was getting closer to the truth. The death of the cartel lieutenant with the rosary confirmed his theory. The violence was ritualistic, theological. He began to investigate the victims of Los Espectros, looking for someone with biblical knowledge and a motive powerful enough to start a suicidal war. That's when he revisited the file on the church massacre. The pastor, Pedro Plata, was listed as deceased, but his body had never been formally identified. The pieces began to fit together in a terrible and logical way. Morales realized he wasn't hunting an ordinary criminal. He was hunting a man who had already been through hell and was now simply dragging his demons back with him. Pedro's crusade intensified. He realized that killing the cartel's soldiers was like cutting off the heads of a hydra. Others would always grow back. To defeat the monster, he had to cut off its lifeblood. Using the information he gathered, he began to attack the infrastructure of Los Espectros. He intercepted a drug shipment crossing the border, setting millions of dollars worth of merchandise on fire. He exposed a front business that served as the main money laundering hub, leading to a federal raid that crippled the cartel's finances. His actions became bolder, more strategic. He was no longer just an avenger. He was a general in a guerrilla war, methodically dismantling El Sombra's empire brick by brick. One night, hiding in the ruins of his own church, feeling the sting of a graze wound after a violent confrontation, exhaustion hit him. The smell of mold and dust mingled with the ghostly memories of hymns and laughter. He sat on one of the broken pews, the place where his flock used to listen to his words of hope. Now, there was only silence and darkness. In this moment of vulnerability, it's as if he spoke through time, sharing the burden of his journey. Sometimes, in this silence, I wonder if there's anything left of the man I used to be. Every step on this road of vengeance takes me further from the light. If you are listening to my story, know that your support, your subscription to this channel, gives me a reason to keep telling it, so that their sacrifice is not forgotten. Pedro's effectiveness forced El Perro into a desperate measure. Knowing that the vigilante seemed to protect the innocent, he orchestrated a hostage situation in a local market. The news spread. It was an obvious trap, and everyone knew who the message was for. El Sombra wanted the ghost out of the shadows and exposed to the light. This put Pedro in a torturous dilemma. To ignore the trap would mean the deaths of civilians, a betrayal of everything he had once stood for. To walk into the trap would mean almost certain death and the end of his revenge. For the first time since beginning his journey, his goal of vengeance and his residual moral code were in direct conflict. The choice he made would define what was left of his soul. He didn't hesitate. Seeing the terrified families, the same ones who had once sought his blessing, was enough to reignite the last spark of the pastor. He chose to save them. Using the chaos and panic to his advantage, he infiltrated the market, moving through the stalls and crowds like an apparition. He eliminated El Perro's men one by one, with silent and deadly precision, using the trap itself against them. The action culminated in a frantic firefight where he managed to free the hostages, but not before being seriously wounded in the shoulder. He escaped by a hair's breadth, disappearing into the night, but not before dozens of witnesses saw the vigilante risk his own life to protect them, cementing his legend as a dark angel. The real hunt, however, was for El Perro. Pedro, using information he forced from one of the henchmen captured at the market, tracked the sadist to an abandoned slaughterhouse on the outskirts of the city. The confrontation was inevitable and personal. There was no strategy, only a brutal clash of hatred. The fight was savage, a macabre dance among rusty chains and animal carcasses. El Perro, bigger and stronger, taunted Pedro, boasting about the details of his family's death. This cruelty was his final mistake. It fueled Pedro's fury, transforming him into a force of nature. He used his agility and his pain as weapons, and finally he managed to subdue the monster that haunted his nightmares. Before delivering the final blow, Pedro became the confessor El Perro never had. With the blade of a knife at his throat, he forced him to confess, not his sins to God, but his master's secrets. Under pain and terror, El Perro revealed everything: the location of El Sombra's fortress, his routines, his defenses. Pedro extracted every piece of information he needed, his face a mask of icy fury. He wanted El Perro to know that his death would not just be retribution, but the key to the destruction of everything he served. After the confession was torn from him, Pedro offered no absolution, only the end. He fulfilled the promise he made to himself, and one more piece of his painful past was avenged. Detective Morales arrived at the slaughterhouse following the trail of blood left by Pedro. He found the body of El Perro, a silent testament to the brutality of the confrontation. Near the body, Morales saw footprints that matched those of a boot he had identified at previous scenes. But it was a small detail that confirmed his suspicions once and for all. A piece of fabric caught on a metal hook, a dark fragment that looked like it was from a priest's cassock. The truth lay bare and raw before him. Pedro Plata was alive, and he was the vigilante. The question was no longer who, but what to do. Arrest the man who was doing the job the police were too inept or corrupt to do. The law and justice had never seemed so far apart. Guided by a mix of duty and a reluctant admiration, Morales used his detective skills to find Pedro's hideout. The confrontation took place in an old auto repair shop. No guns were drawn. It was a meeting of two men, broken by the same system, each on a different side of a blurred moral line. "I know who you are, Pastor," Morales said softly. "This has to stop. You've become a killer." Pedro, cleaning his wounds, looked at him with empty eyes. "They made me a killer the day they murdered my family in the house of God. You serve a law that protects them. I serve a justice that condemns them. Which one of us is truly wrong?" Morales had no answer. He turned and walked away, leaving the law behind. With El Perro's death and his operations dismantled, El Sombra felt the circle closing in. His once unshakable empire was crumbling. Paranoia consumed him. Seeing enemies in every shadow, he entrenched himself in his final refuge, a majestic, abandoned cathedral on a hilltop, which he had transformed into a profane fortress, filled with decadent luxuries and guards armed to the teeth. The place that should have been a symbol of faith was now the serpent's nest. It was a poetic and sick irony. Pedro's journey, which began with the destruction of his church, was destined to end in the annihilation of another, in a final confrontation against the devil who had crowned himself king. The journey to the cathedral was long and painful for Pedro. His body was at its limit, his wounds barely healed, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the exhaustion of his soul. He was no longer driven by anger, but by an empty momentum, a need to finish what he had started. In his cabin, he gathered his last weapons, each bullet a promise. He knew it was a suicide mission. He didn't expect to leave that cathedral alive. Survival was never the goal. The goal was final retribution, to ensure that El Sombra would meet him in hell. He looked one last time at the photo of his family, not to motivate himself, but to say goodbye to the man he once was. As he prepared to leave, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Maria. She sensed that this night was different, decisive. She didn't come to stop him, not anymore. She knew it was useless. She simply came to say goodbye to the man she still saw beneath the layers of darkness. "May God have mercy on your soul, Pedro," she whispered, handing him a small wooden cross, the same one he had given her years before. Pedro accepted it, the small object feeling heavy in his hand. "God abandoned me a long time ago, Maria," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But thank you." It was a moment of tragic tenderness, the last human connection before he embraced his solitary fate and plunged into the final darkness. The infiltration of the cathedral was a masterpiece of stealth and violence. Pedro used the darkness of the night and the Gothic architecture to his advantage, moving through the beams and corridors like a spectre. El Sombra's guards, accustomed to a life of power and impunity, were not prepared for such a silent and focused predator. He eliminated them one by one with ghostly efficiency, using the shadows of stone saints and the echoes of empty hallways to mask his approach. The silence of the cathedral was broken only by the muffled gasps of the men who fell in his path. Each death brought him one step closer to the heart of that profane fortress, closer to his final target. Finally, he reached the massive doors of the main nave, now converted into a kind of throne room for El Sombra. He could hear classical music playing inside, a surreal sound that contrasted with the trail of bodies he had left behind. Pushing the doors open slowly, he saw his target. El Sombra was sitting in an opulent armchair, his back to the entrance, savoring a glass of whiskey, as if he were waiting for him. The air was heavy with the inevitability of the confrontation. The hunt was over. The two kings of opposing realms were on the same board, ready for the final move. The battle for the soul of Santa Magdalena and for the lost soul of Pedro Plata was about to begin in the desecrated heart of the house of God. El Sombra turned slowly in his armchair, a mocking smile on his lips. There was no surprise on his face, only the boredom of a king finding a rebellious peasant at his gates. "The pastor," he said, his voice echoing in the empty nave. "I wondered when God's little lamb would finally show his teeth. Tell me, where was your God when my pack visited your church? Was he watching? Did he enjoy the sermon of blood my men preached on your altar?" Every word was a stab, calculated to reopen the wounds in Pedro's soul. El Sombra didn't see a divine avenger, but a broken man, and he delighted in the idea of breaking what was left. The final battle would begin not with bullets, but with the desecration of the last drop of faith that might exist in Pedro. The desecrated cathedral was El Sombra's chessboard. He strolled between the broken pews, using a stolen golden chalice to drink his whiskey, a deliberate act of contempt. He felt at home in that ruined sanctuary, for he believed that power and fear were the only true gods. But Pedro knew the house of God in a way the drug lord never could. He merged with the shadows, using the confessionals as hiding places, the upper galleries as vantage points. The echo of the vast hall, which El Sombra used to amplify his mocking voice, Pedro used to mask his movements. The sacred setting became a double-edged sword, with every statue of a saint and every crucifix bearing witness to the war between the devil and the ghost he had created. The exchange of venomous words finally gave way to the eruption of violence. El Sombra's first shot shattered the silence, and the cathedral turned into a battlefield. The fight was a chaotic ballet of fury and pain, sending them crashing against the stone pillars and rolling down the altar steps. It was not a clean shootout, but a visceral and desperate confrontation. The moonlight, flooding in through the broken stained glass windows, cast distorted images of saints and demons on the two men, as if heaven and hell were watching their brutal struggle. Each of them absorbed and inflicted pain, driven by opposing forces. one by the sadism of power, the other by the absolute emptiness of loss. The air grew heavy with the smell of gunpowder and blood. In a moment of savagery, El Sombra gained the upper hand. Stronger and less wounded, he knocked Pedro to the ground with a brutal pistol whip. Pedro's gun skittered away, out of reach. Bleeding and with his vision blurred, he found himself at the foot of the altar, his enemy looming over him like an angel of death. Despair threatened to swallow him. It was then that his gaze fixed on the large metal crucifix that still hung, solitary and crooked, above the altar. The image of Christ in agony did not bring him comfort or a miracle. Instead, it acted as a mirror of his own sacrifice, of his own loss at that other altar. A wave of cold, primordial fury surged from the depths of his soul, a force born not of faith, but of its complete and utter absence. That fury revived him. With a cry that was more animal than human, he launched himself upward, ignoring the searing pain. He was no longer a strategist or a hunter. He was the personification of retribution. He grabbed the heavy base of a bronze candelabra and used it as a club, attacking with a ferocity that shocked El Sombra. The cartel leader, accustomed to seeing fear in the eyes of his victims, saw something much worse. A void, a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. The tide of the battle turned decisively and brutally. Pedro disarmed his enemy, and the gunfight became a raw execution, with the broken pastor beating the devil into submission. With El Sombra fallen and bloodied at his feet, on the same altar he had turned into his throne, Pedro found himself at the final moment of his journey. The monster who took everything from him was at his mercy. Before the final blow, a clear thought cut through the fog of his rage, a dark truth he felt he needed to share. In that instant, looking into the eyes of the man who destroyed my life, I understood. Justice sometimes must be torn from the world with one's own hands. If you, who are listening, have ever felt that helplessness, that need to fight when no one else would fight for you, subscribe, because it is so the cries of the forgotten can be heard, that stories like mine exist. He then raised the heavy wooden cross he carried, the symbol of his former faith, and used it to deliver the final judgment, an act of vengeance that sealed his fate. The sound of the final blow echoed through the cathedral and then dissipated into a deep and absolute silence. El Sombra lay lifeless on the desecrated altar. Pedro stood over him, his chest heaving, his body a mass of pain and exhaustion. He expected to feel relief, triumph, perhaps even peace, but he felt nothing. The consuming fire of vengeance that had driven him for so long, that had given meaning to his shattered existence, was finally extinguished. In its place, only a cold void remained, a darkness deeper than any he had ever known. He had won the war, killed the demon, but in the process, he had annihilated himself. The victory tasted of bitter ashes, and in the stillness of that dead cathedral, Pedro Plata was completely and irrevocably alone. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight penetrated the broken stained glass windows of the cathedral, illuminating the macabre scene. Pedro, barely able to stand, a spectre of blood and exhaustion, did not stay to witness the arrival of the new day. He left the heavy wooden cross on the altar next to the body of his enemy, a final, terrible sacrament. With slow, painful steps, he walked out of the cathedral and dissolved into the labyrinthine alleys of Santa Magdalena, just as the rising sun dissolved the shadows of the night. He did not look back. There was nothing for him there, not in the past, nor in the future. Victory brought no redemption, only the end of a painful chapter. He walked aimlessly, no longer a pastor, no longer a vigilante, just an empty man haunted by ghosts under a brightening sky. The news of El Sombra's death traveled through the city with the speed of a whisper on the wind, growing into a clamor of disbelief and, finally, of relief. Without its sadistic leader, the Los Espectros cartel collapsed like a house of cards. Internal power struggles led to its self-destruction, allowing law enforcement previously intimidated to finally clean up the remnants of the organization. Santa Magdalena took its first breath of fresh air in a decade. The legend of the vigilante was sealed in the city's soul. He was the fallen angel who had brought them salvation, a dark saint whose fury had returned their peace. No one knew who he was, and no one wanted to know. It was enough that he had existed, and that the monsters were afraid of his shadow. Detective Morales was the first to arrive at the scene in the cathedral. He surveyed the carnage, the body of El Sombra, and the wooden cross left like a tombstone. In his official report, he attributed the death to a violent power struggle within the cartel. The case of the vigilante, the phantom crusader who had terrorized the underworld, was officially closed, filed away as an unsolved urban myth. It was Morales's final act of complicity, his way of honoring the brutal justice that achieved what the law never could. He knew that arresting Pedro Plata would be the greatest injustice of all. By closing that file, he was not just protecting a man, but preserving a legend that he hoped would serve as an eternal warning to anyone who tried to plunge the city into darkness again. Far from the chaos and investigations, Maria returned to Pedro's small church. With her own hands, she cleaned the dust, mended the broken pews, and opened the windows to let the light in once more. She became the silent keeper of the man's memory, not the monster's. In front of the altar where the tragedy began, she lit 2 candles, one for the souls of Elena and Sofia, and another, more hesitantly, for the lost soul of Pastor Pedro Plata. She didn't know if he was alive or dead, but she prayed not for his salvation, which she feared was beyond reach, but that he might somehow find a glimpse of the peace he had sacrificed for his revenge. The church slowly became a place of hope again. Pedro Plata was never seen again. He became a legend, a ghost whispered on desert nights, a story told to remind men of the terrible price of vengeance. He achieved his goal but lost his soul in the process, leaving a disturbing question for all who hear his story. Was he a hero, a monster, or simply a man who loved too much and was driven too far by pain? The answer may not exist. His journey shows us that the line between justice and revenge is as thin as a razor's edge. I thank you for staying with me to the end of this account. Stories like Pedro's force us to look into the darkness within ourselves. If you believe these journeys deserve to be told, please subscribe to the channel to help us continue exploring the complex human soul.